Sometimes life gives you a choice that no father should ever have to make. Sometimes being a hero means living with a broken heart for the rest of your days. Tobias Fletcher was a homeless cowboy who hadn't seen his daughter in 3 years. When the orphanage caught fire, he ran inside to save the children. He pulled out a boy named Billy first. Then he went back for the others and found his own little girl trapped in the flames. He saved her too, but she died in his arms. The town called him a hero for saving the orphan boy. But how do you live with being called a hero when your own child didn't make it? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 years before that terrible night, Tobias Fletcher had been a different man entirely. He'd owned a small ranch outside Millbrook, worked honest days under the endless prairie sky, and came home each evening to a wife who still smiled when she heard his boots on the porch. Mary Fletcher had been the kind of woman who could make beans and cornbread taste like Sunday dinner, who hummed while she mended his shirts, who read scripture aloud by lamplight while their daughter Anna played with her wooden blocks on the kitchen floor. Anna had been 5 then, all wild curls and curious questions, forever asking why the sky was so big or where the cattle went when they wandered over the hills. She'd follow him around the ranch on stubby legs, chattering about everything and nothing, her small hand tucked trustingly in his calloused palm. Those had been good days, simple days, when a man's biggest worry was whether the creek would hold through August, or if the winter feed would last till spring. Then the fever came. It started as a cough, nothing more than Mary clearing her throat while she kneaded bread. Within a week, she was burning with heat that no amount of cool cloths could ease. Doc Henley did what he could, but in those days, before the railroad brought modern medicines, sometimes a body just gave up the fight. Mary lasted 10 days, growing thinner and paler each sunrise, until one morning she simply didn't wake up. Anna hadn't understood. How could she? At 5 years old, death was just a word adults whispered, not the cold reality that meant Mama wouldn't be making breakfast anymore, wouldn't be singing lullabies, wouldn't be there to kiss scraped knees or braid tangled hair. Tobias had tried to explain, had held his daughter while she sobbed into his shirt, but what words exist for such loss? The ranch became a tomb after that. Every corner held memories of Mary's laughter, every room echoed with her absence. Tobias found himself drinking more, sleeping less, letting the cattle wander while he sat on the porch with a bottle and stared at nothing. Anna grew quieter, more careful, as if she sensed her father slipping away from her too. When Mary's sister Margaret came from Kansas City for the funeral, she took one look at the unwashed dishes, the unmended fences, the little girl with tangled hair and hollow eyes, and made her intentions clear. This child needs a proper home, Margaret had said, her voice crisp with judgment. A woman's care. You're drowning, Tobias, and you're taking Anna down with you. He should have fought harder, should have sobered up, cleaned house, proved he could be the father Anna deserved. Instead, he'd stood there like a kicked dog, while Margaret packed his daughter's few belongings into a carpet bag, promising Anna she'd have cousins to play with and a real school to attend. Will Papa come visit? Anna had asked, her small hand clutching the rag doll Mary had sewn for her 3rd birthday. Someday, sweetheart, Margaret had replied, but her eyes had fixed on Tobias with a look that said she'd fight to prevent exactly that. The last thing Tobias remembered clearly was Anna's face in the stage window, pressed against the glass as the coach pulled away, her mouth forming the word "Papa" that he couldn't hear over the creaking wheels and his own thundering heartbeat. After that, the days blurred together like watercolors in rain. He sold the ranch for a fraction of its worth, drank away most of the money, and took to drifting from town to town, picking up work where he could find it. Sometimes he'd get a job that lasted a month or two, convince himself he was getting back on his feet, but something would always go wrong. He'd get into a fight, or show up drunk, or simply disappear one morning because staying in one place too long made him remember what he'd lost. Millbrook had been just another stop on that downward spiral. He'd arrived 6 months ago with nothing but the clothes on his back and a horse too old to be worth stealing. The town sat in a valley surrounded by wheat fields that had gone brown from drought, its main street lined with buildings that seemed to lean against each other for support. The silver mine that had founded the settlement had played out years ago, leaving behind empty shafts and abandoned dreams. Most folks in Millbrook were hanging on by their fingernails. Just like everywhere else in this hard country, the bank had foreclosed on 3 farms this year alone, and half the storefronts on Main Street stood empty. It was the kind of place where a down-on-his-luck cowboy could find work mucking stables or hauling freight. No questions asked about where he'd been or why he'd left. Tobias had taken a room above Sullivan's saloon, paying weekly rent that barely kept him ahead of eviction. He worked odd jobs for Doc Henley, the town physician, who had a soft heart for strays, and picked up day labor at Miller's feed store when his back could handle the lifting. Some evenings, he'd sit in the saloon nursing a single whiskey, all he could afford, and listen to the old-timers talk about better days that seemed as distant as the stars. The other regulars had learned to leave him alone. Tobias Fletcher wasn't the kind of man who invited conversation, with his weathered face and eyes that held too much sorrow for polite company. He was just another ghost haunting the margins of a dying town, and ghosts, as everyone knew, were best left undisturbed. But even ghosts had to eat, and that's how Tobias came to know about the orphanage. The Millbrook Home for Children sat on the east side of town, a 2-story wooden building that had once been a boarding house in the town's prosperous days. Mrs. Crawford, the matron, was a widow in her 60s who'd taken on the job when her own children had grown and scattered like tumbleweeds. She had the patience of Job and the organizational skills of a general, keeping 6 orphan children fed, clothed and educated on a budget that wouldn't keep a cat alive in most places. Tobias had done some carpentry work for her, fixing loose boards and patching the roof after a storm. Mrs. Crawford was one of the few people in town who looked him in the eye when she spoke, who didn't seem to see vagrant written across his forehead in permanent ink. "You've got gentle hands for such hard work," she'd observed one afternoon, watching him sand a windowsill smooth. "These children could use a man around who knows how to build things instead of just tearing them down." It was the closest thing to a compliment Tobias had received in years, and it had lodged in his chest like a splinter, uncomfortable and impossible to remove. The children at the orphanage ranged in age from 4 to 12, all casualties of the harsh realities of frontier life. There was Billy Patterson, age 8, whose parents had died in a wagon accident 2 years prior. Billy was quick with numbers and had a way of asking questions that made grown men think harder about their answers. He'd been at the orphanage longest and had appointed himself protector of the younger ones, a responsibility that sat heavy on his narrow shoulders. Tobias had noticed Billy watching him work, those sharp blue eyes taking in every movement of the plane, every measurement of the ruler. The boy reminded him painfully of himself at that age, hungry for knowledge and approval, trying to make sense of a world that seemed determined to break everything good it touched. "Could you show me how to do that?" Billy had asked one day, pointing at the dovetail joint Tobias was cutting. "Takes practice," Tobias had replied, but he'd found himself guiding the boy's small hands, showing him how to hold the saw, how to let the wood guide the blade instead of forcing it. For just a moment, it had felt like being useful again, like being the kind of man who built things up instead of watching them crumble. That evening, walking back to his room above the saloon, Tobias had allowed himself to wonder what Anna was doing. Was she learning to read in that Kansas City school? Did she still play with the rag doll Mary had made, or had she outgrown such childish things? Would she even remember him if they met again on some distant street? The questions followed him like shadows, growing longer as the sun set behind the mountains. By the time he reached his door, the familiar weight of guilt and whiskey were pressing down on his shoulders, and any thoughts of redemption or second chances had faded like morning mist. In Millbrook, Nobody expected much from Tobias Fletcher, and he'd learned not to disappoint them. He was just a broken-down cowboy in a broken-down town, useful for the kind of work that required strong backs and weak ambitions. At least that's what everyone thought until the night the orphanage caught fire. None of them knew that behind his bloodshot eyes and stubbled cheeks, behind the smell of cheap whiskey and cheaper tobacco, there still lived the ghost of a man who'd once been somebody's papa. A man who'd failed the most important test of his life and spent 3 years running from the verdict. But ghosts, as any frontier town knows, have a way of becoming flesh and blood again when the stakes are high enough. And on that October night, with flames reaching toward the stars and children screaming in the distance, Tobias Fletcher was about to remember who he used to be. The question was whether remembering would save him or destroy him completely. Outside his window, the first wisps of smoke were beginning to rise from the east side of town, though he didn't know it yet. He was sitting on his narrow bed, holding the worn leather Bible that had belonged to Mary, its pages marked with her careful handwriting in the margins. He couldn't read the words anymore. The whiskey and the darkness conspired against him, but he could trace the faded ink with his finger and remember the sound of her voice reading aloud by lamplight. Soon, very soon, that voice would call him back to himself. But first, there would be fire. The smell of smoke drifted through Tobias's window like a whispered warning. Barely noticeable at first, beneath the familiar odors of the saloon below, stale beer, tobacco, and the lingering scent of fried potatoes from the evening meal. He might have ignored it entirely, might have blamed it on someone's chimney or a campfire down by the creek, but something in the quality of that smoke made him lift his head from Mary's Bible and turn toward the glass. Orange light flickered against the buildings across the street, dancing shadows that spoke of flames much larger than any hearth fire. Tobias rose unsteadily, his joints protesting after hours of sitting hunched over pages he couldn't focus on anyway. The whiskey in his system made the room sway slightly, but not enough to dull the growing alarm that prickled at the base of his skull. He pushed the window open wider and leaned out into the cool October air. The smoke was thicker now, acrid with the smell of burning wood and something else, something that made his stomach clench with sudden recognition. He'd smelled that particular combination before, years ago, when the Hendricks barn had caught fire with livestock trapped inside. It was the smell of panic, of living things in mortal danger. From the east side of town came the sound of shouting, men's voices raised in urgent coordination, and beneath it all, a sound that turned his blood to ice water. Children screaming, the orphanage. Tobias was moving before conscious thought caught up with action, grabbing his boots and jamming his feet into them without bothering to sit down. He snatched his hat from the bedpost and was out the door, taking the narrow stairs 3 at a time, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird. Sullivan's saloon was nearly empty. Most of the evening crowd had already heard the commotion and rushed toward the fire. Only old Pete remained at his corner table, too drunk to notice anything beyond the bottom of his glass. Tobias burst through the batwing doors onto Main Street and immediately saw what he'd feared most. The orphanage was completely engulfed. Flames poured from the ground floor windows like liquid hell, licking up the wooden siding toward the second story, where the children slept. Black smoke billowed into the star-filled sky, and even from 3 blocks away, Tobias could feel the heat pressing against his face like an open furnace. He ran, his legs, unsteady moments before, found their strength as he pounded down the dirt street. Behind him, more people were emerging from buildings, shouting questions and commands, but their voices faded into background noise. All Tobias could hear was the roar of the fire, and cutting through it like a blade, the high, desperate cries of trapped children. A crowd had gathered in the street before the blazing building. Doc Henley was there, his medical bag clutched uselessly in his hands as he stared at the inferno. Sheriff Mills paced back and forth, his face grim in the firelight. Mrs. Crawford knelt in the dirt, her grey hair wild around her shoulders, sobbing as 2 women held her back from rushing toward the flames. How many inside? Tobias gasped as he reached the group. 6 children, Doc Henley replied without taking his eyes off the burning structure. Mrs. Crawford was in town getting supplies when it started. By the time we got here, the ground floor was already lost. Through the smoke and flame, Tobias could see movement in the second-story windows. Small shapes pressed against the glass, hands beating helplessly at panes that had warped from the heat and wouldn't open. One window showed Billy's face, mouth open in a scream Tobias couldn't hear over the roar of destruction. "We can't get to them," Sheriff Mills said, his voice tight with helpless rage. "The stairs are gone and we don't have a ladder tall enough. The volunteer fire brigade won't arrive for another hour, and by then he didn't finish. He didn't need to. Tobias studied the building with the eye of a man who'd built his share of structures. The front entrance was impassable, a tunnel of flame that would kill anyone foolish enough to attempt it. But around the side, where the kitchen addition had been built lower, the roof was still intact. If a man could get onto that roof, he might be able to break through to the second floor from above. "Give me an axe," he said quietly. "What?" Sheriff Mills turned to stare at him. "An axe. And get me a rope if you've got one." "Tobias, you can't," Doc Henley began. But Tobias was already moving toward Miller's feed store across the street, where he knew tools were kept for emergency repairs. He kicked in the door. Miller could bill him later if there was a later, and grabbed a fire axe from the wall. Someone had found rope, 50 feet of good hemp line that would hold a man's weight. Tobias tied one end around his waist and handed the other to Sheriff Mills. "When I get them out, I'll lower them down. You catch them. This is suicide," Mills protested, but he took the rope. Tobias looked once more at the burning building, at the faces in the windows growing fainter as smoke thickened around them. In one of those windows, a child was waiting to die. 6 children. Billy, who'd asked about dovetail joints and watched with hungry eyes as Tobias worked. Children who deserved better than this, who deserved a chance to grow up and make their own mistakes. He thought of Anna, 3 years gone, and wondered if this was what God's judgment looked like, a chance to save someone else's child because he'd failed to save his own. Without another word, Tobias sprinted toward the side of the building. The kitchen roof was 8 feet off the ground, but rain barrels and a woodpile gave him the boost he needed. The shingles were hot beneath his hands, and smoke poured around him as he crawled toward the main structure. Through the roof, he could hear the children crying, their voices growing weaker. He positioned himself over where he knew the hallway ran and brought the axe down with all his strength. The blade bit through tar paper and shingles, then again through the wooden planks beneath. Heat and smoke erupted through the hole like a geyser, and Tobias had to roll aside to keep from being roasted alive. "Here," he shouted down through the opening. "Come to my voice." Billy appeared first, his face streaked with soot, coughing so hard he could barely stand. Tobias grabbed the boy under his arms and hauled him up through the hole, then quickly lowered him on the rope to the waiting hands below. "Who else is up there?" Tobias called down. "Lucy and Tom in the next room," Billy gasped before Sheriff Mills carried him to safety. But the smoke swallowed his words. Tobias enlarged the hole and dropped down into the hallway. The heat was like walking into an oven, and the smoke burned his lungs with every breath. He felt his way along the wall, calling out, until small hands grabbed his coat. 2 more children. A girl about 6 and a boy no more than 4. Too frightened to do anything but cling to each other in the corner. Tobias scooped them both up and carried them back to his improvised exit. It took precious minutes to get them through the hole and down the rope, minutes during which the fire gained strength and the floor beneath his feet grew soft with heat. "Anyone else?" he shouted to Billy, who was being tended by Doc Henley in the street. "Anna!" Billy cried, pointing toward the far end of the building. "Anna's still in there." The name hit Tobias like a physical blow. Anna. Not his Anna, surely. His daughter was safe in Kansas City, growing up with her aunt's family. But another Anna, another little girl who would die because he wasn't fast enough. Wasn't brave enough, wasn't good enough. He moved deeper into the burning building. The hallway was a tunnel of heat and choking smoke. Flames had begun eating through the floor in places, and Tobias could see down into the inferno below. He called Anna's name and heard a weak response from the last room, the one farthest from his escape route. The door was stuck, warped from heat. Tobias put his shoulder to it and pushed with everything he had left. It gave way suddenly, sending him stumbling into the room. She was huddled in the corner, a girl of maybe 8 years old with dark hair and eyes that were too familiar. Too much like the eyes that had watched him from a stage window 3 years ago. But it wasn't until he knelt beside her and she looked up at him with recognition, dawning on her soot-stained face, that the impossible truth hit him like a thunderbolt. "Papa?" she whispered. It was Anna, his daughter, who should have been safe in Kansas City, was here in this burning building, her small body racked with coughing, her eyes wide with terror and hope, and something that might have been forgiveness. "I knew you'd come," she said simply, and reached up her arms to him. Tobias gathered her against his chest, feeling how light she'd become, how fragile. Questions flooded his mind. How was she here? Why hadn't Margaret told him what had happened? But there was no time for answers. The floor was giving way beneath them, and Anna's breathing was growing weaker with each second. He carried her toward the hole in the roof, but the way was blocked now by fallen timbers. Flames surrounded them on 3 sides, and the heat was so intense it seemed to be stealing the very air from their lungs. "It's going to be all right, sweetheart," he murmured into her hair, the same words he'd spoken when she was small and afraid of thunderstorms. "Papa's here. Papa's got you." He found a window, the glass already cracked from heat. Using the axe handle, he smashed it outward and looked down at a 15-foot drop to the hard ground below. Too far to jump with Anna in his arms, but maybe the rope. It was still tied around his waist, though he'd cut it to free the other children. There was maybe 20 feet left, enough to lower Anna most of the way to safety. Working quickly, his hands shaking from more than the smoke, he tied the rope around Anna's small waist. "I'm going to lower you down," he told her. "Sheriff Mills will catch you. You'll be safe. What about you, Papa?" "I'll be right behind you," he lied, knowing the rope wouldn't hold for a second trip. Knowing the building was seconds from complete collapse, Anna looked at him with those 2 knowing eyes. The eyes of a child who'd seen too much loss already. "I missed you every day," she said. "I missed you too, baby girl. More than you'll ever know." He lowered her through the window, watching until gentle hands received her below. Then he looked around the burning room, accepting what he'd known all along. There was no way out for him. The floor was soft as rotting wood beneath his feet. The walls were sheets of flame, and the roof above was starting to sag inward. At least Anna was safe. At least he'd managed to do one thing right in his worthless life, but the building had other ideas. With a crack like thunder, the floor gave way completely, and Tobias fell into the heart of the inferno. Anna's name on his lips, and the memory of her trust shining in his mind like a star. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the silver locket around Anna's neck, the one that held Mary's picture, gleaming in the firelight as she was carried to safety. The last thing he felt was something that might have been peace. Tobias woke 3 days later in Doc Henley's spare room, his body wrapped in bandages that smelled of carbolic acid and medicinal herbs. The first thing he saw was Billy Patterson, sitting in a chair beside the bed. The boy's small hands clutched around a cloth bundle that Tobias couldn't quite make out through the haze of pain and laudanum. "You're awake," Billy said quietly, his voice hoarse from the smoke they'd both inhaled. "Doc said you might not make it. Said you breathed in too much bad air." Memory crashed over Tobias like a cold wave. The fire, the rescue. Anna's face in that last moment, her arms reaching up to him with perfect trust. The feel of her small body growing limp in his arms as the smoke stole her breath away. "Anna," he croaked, though part of him already knew. Billy's face crumpled. "She didn't wake up, Mr. Fletcher. Doc tried everything, but she just never woke up. The smoke got her lungs too bad." The words hit harder than any physical pain. Tobias closed his eyes and felt the weight of failure settle on his chest like a gravestone. He'd found his daughter again after 3 years of loss and separation, held her in his arms. He promised her safety and then watched her die anyway. She asked for you, Billy continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Right before she went to sleep. She said to tell you she wasn't afraid because Papa had come for her. Something broke inside Tobias then, something that had been barely holding together for 3 years. He turned his face toward the wall and wept with the helpless grief of a man who'd been granted a miracle only to watch it slip through his fingers like sand. Billy sat quietly through it all, understanding in the way that children who'd known loss could understand. When the tears finally stopped, the boy held out the bundle he'd been clutching. This was Anna's, he said. Mrs. Crawford said you should have it. Tobias unwrapped the cloth with shaking hands. Inside was a rag doll, carefully mended in several places, with yarn hair and button eyes. But more precious than the doll itself was what Anna had tucked inside its cloth body, a small silver locket on a delicate chain. With trembling fingers, Tobias opened the locket. Inside was a tiny photograph of Mary, so young and beautiful it made his heart ache, and on the opposite side, a lock of Anna's dark hair tied with thread. She always carried that, Billy said. Told me it had her mama's picture in it. Said her papa gave it to her before she had to go away, but Tobias had never given Anna this locket. He'd never even seen it before. Which meant, Billy, he said carefully, how long had Anna been at the orphanage? Just a few months. She came in the spring, after her aunt got sick and couldn't take care of her no more. She used to talk about her papa sometimes. Said he was a cowboy who'd come find her someday. The guilt that had been eating at Tobias since the fire suddenly shifted, becoming something even more unbearable. Anna had been here, in the same town where he'd been drinking and drifting and feeling sorry for himself. She'd been waiting for him, believing he'd come, while he'd been too lost in his own misery to even know she existed. Over the next few days, as his burns healed and his strength returned, the full scope of his failure became clear. Martha Kellens, Anna's aunt from Kansas City, arrived for the funeral, a thin, nervous woman who looked like she'd been carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. I wanted to write to you, she told Tobias as they stood beside Anna's small grave. But we didn't know where you were, and Anna made me promise not to send her back if you couldn't be found. She was so afraid you wouldn't want her. Why did you bring her here? Martha's face crumpled with guilt. I got consumption. The doctor said I might not last the winter. Anna needed somewhere safe, and Mrs. Crawford has such a good reputation. I thought it would just be temporary. I thought I'd get better and come for her, or find you somehow. She pressed a letter into his hands, the envelope yellowed and worn from much handling. Anna wrote this for you. She made me promise to give it to you if anything happened to her. Tobias waited until he was alone to read it. Anna's careful script, still learning the proper formation of letters, filled both sides of the paper. Dear Papa, Aunt Martha says you might not get this letter, but I am writing it anyway. I'm at the orphanage in Millbrook now. Mrs. Crawford is nice, and there are other children here. Billy is my best friend. He is very smart and knows about numbers. I hope you are not still sad about Mama. I miss her too, but I remember what she used to say about how people we love never really go away if we keep them in our hearts. I keep you in my heart every day, Papa. I know you had to go away after Mama died, but I understand now that grown-ups sometimes need time to heal, just like children do. If you ever come looking for me, I will be waiting. Billy says his papa used to be sad too after his mama died, but he got better when Billy was born. Maybe we can get better together. I love you, Papa. I know you love me too, even when you are far away. Your daughter, Anna P.S. I still have Mama's locket. I wear it every day so she can watch over me until you come home. Tobias read the letter 17 times, memorizing every word, every carefully formed letter, every sign of the daughter he'd lost twice now. The paper grew damp from his tears, but he couldn't seem to stop them. The town had tried to make him a hero. Newspaper reporters from the territorial capital had come to interview the brave cowboy who risked his life to save orphaned children. They wanted to write about his courage, His quick thinking, his selfless action in the face of danger, but they didn't understand. Heroes saved people. Heroes didn't let their own daughters die in their arms. Heroes didn't spend 3 years drowning in whiskey, while their children waited in orphanages, hoping Papa would come home. The other children he'd saved were recovering well. Little Lucy and Tom had been placed with families in neighboring towns, eager to escape the memories of that terrible night. But Billy remained at Doc Henley's house, his future uncertain. The orphanage was gone, reduced to a pile of charred timbers and ash. Mrs. Crawford was too heartbroken to consider starting over, and the few other children's homes in the territory were already overcrowded. What's going to happen to him? Tobias asked Doc Henley one evening as they sat on the porch, watching Billy play with a stick and hoop in the yard. Hard to say, the doctor replied, packing tobacco into his pipe. He's got an uncle in Colorado, but the man's a bachelor who works in the mines. Not much of a life for a boy. There's talk of sending him to the territorial home in Denver, but that place is more warehouse than home. Tobias watched Billy roll the hoop in careful circles, his young face serious with concentration. The boy moved with the deliberate care of someone who'd learned not to expect much from life, who treated every small pleasure as a temporary gift that might be snatched away at any moment. He asks about you, Doc Henley continued. Wants to know when you're going back to work, if you'll teach him more about carpentry. Boy's got no shortage of questions. I'm not much of a teacher, maybe not, but you're the closest thing to a father figure he's got right now. That counts for something? That night, Billy approached Tobias as he sat on the porch steps, staring at nothing. The boy held something behind his back, his expression mixing hope and uncertainty. Mr. Fletcher, I made something for you. He brought his hands forward to reveal a small wooden horse, roughly carved but recognizable. The proportions were wrong and the legs uneven, but it had been sanded smooth and polished with obvious care. It's not very good, Billy said quickly, as if anticipating rejection. I know you could make a better one, but I wanted to try. Tobias took the horse and turned it over in his hands. The wood was soft pine, probably scavenged from the debris pile behind Miller's store. Billy had used a pocket knife to carve it, working by lamplight after Doc Henley had gone to bed. It's fine work, Tobias said quietly. Real fine work for a first try. Billy's face lit up with a smile that could have powered the whole town. Really? You think so? I do. Horse has good lines. Stands sturdy. That's what matters. For the first time since waking up in this bed, Tobias felt something other than grief and guilt. It was small, fragile as a soap bubble, but it was there, a tiny spark of purpose, of connection to something beyond his own pain. Maybe that was what Anna's letter had been trying to tell him. Maybe healing didn't happen in isolation, but in the space between people who needed each other. Maybe redemption wasn't something you found, but something you built, one careful cut at a time, like whittling a horse from a scrap of pine. Billy was still grinning, obviously proud of his accomplishment. Will you teach me to make a better one? When you're feeling up to it, I mean. Tobias looked at the boy, this child who'd survived fire and loss, who still had faith in tomorrow despite everything he'd endured. Anna was gone, beyond his reach forever. But Billy was here, asking for nothing more complicated than the chance to learn something new. I reckon I could do that, Tobias said finally. But it'll take patience. Good carving can't be rushed. I got plenty of patience, Billy assured him solemnly. I've been waiting my whole life to learn something useful. That night, for the first time since the fire, Tobias fell asleep without seeing Anna's face in the flames. Instead, he dreamed of wood shavings and small hands learning to guide a knife, of second chances carved from the remnants of first failures. 2 weeks after the fire, Tobias found himself standing in front of a one-room cabin on the outskirts of town, a set of keys heavy in his palm, and a boy beside him carrying everything he owned in a flour sack. The cabin had belonged to old Pete's brother before consumption took him the previous winter. It wasn't much. 4 walls, a stone fireplace, and a roof that only leaked in 3 places, but it was more home than either Tobias or Billy had known in years. It's got a good view, Billy observed. looking out across the valley where wheat stubble caught the late afternoon sun like scattered gold. "And there's room for a garden come spring. You know anything about gardens?" Tobias asked, surprised by the boy's practical optimism. "Some. Mrs. Crawford taught us about growing things. Said children needed to know where food comes from, not just expect it to appear on tables like magic." Tobias pushed open the door, and they stepped into the cabin's single room. Dust motes danced in the slanted light from the windows, and somewhere a field mouse scurried away from their footsteps. The previous occupant had left behind a few basic necessities: a table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed, and a shelf lined with mason jars that still smelled faintly of pickled vegetables. "Where will I sleep?" Billy asked, practical as always. Tobias looked around the small space and realized he hadn't thought that far ahead. When Doc Henley had suggested they take the cabin together, temporarily, until Billy's future could be properly sorted, Tobias had agreed mostly to stop the well-meaning doctor from making more permanent arrangements. "We'll figure something out," he said finally. "Maybe build a cot, or I could sleep by the fireplace," Billy offered. "I don't take up much room, and I'm used to sleeping on floors." The orphanage wasn't exactly feather beds and silk sheets. The matter-of-fact way Billy accepted potential hardship twisted something in Tobias's chest. This boy, who'd lost everything twice over, was still trying to make things easier for the adults around him. "We'll see about getting you a proper bed," Tobias said firmly. "A boy needs his own place to sleep." Billy's face lit up with surprised gratitude, as if the concept of his own bed was a luxury beyond imagining. They spent the rest of that first day making the cabin habitable. Tobias patched the worst of the roof leaks, while Billy swept out the debris and scrubbed years of neglect from the windows. They worked mostly in comfortable silence, but occasionally Billy would ask questions about why rain found its way through even tiny cracks, about the best way to cut shingles, about whether Tobias had ever lived in a place this small before. "Once," Tobias admitted, hammering a repair patch into place. "When I was about your age, my pa and I lived in a soddy out on the plains. Just one room, dirt walls, roof made of grass. This place would have seemed like a palace. What happened to your pa? Drank himself to death when I was 14. Billy digested this information with the seriousness of a child who understood that life rarely offered happy endings. "Is that why you started drinking? After Anna's mama died?" The question caught Tobias off guard with its directness. He paused in his hammering, considering how much truth a boy could handle. "Partly," he said finally. "Seemed easier than dealing with the hurt. But it didn't make anything better. Just made everything worse. Are you going to drink yourself to death too?" Tobias looked down at Billy, who was watching him with those sharp blue eyes that seemed to see straight through pretense to the truth beneath. "I don't know," Tobias answered honestly. "I hope not. But it's a hard thing to stop once it gets its hooks in you." Billy nodded sagely, as if this made perfect sense to him. "Mrs. Crawford used to say that bad habits were like weeds. You had to pull them out root and all, or they'd just keep growing back." Mrs. Crawford sounds like a wise woman. She was. She used to tell us that people could change if they wanted to bad enough. Said the wanting was the hardest part, but once you really wanted something different, the rest was just work. That evening, they cooked their first meal together over the fireplace, beans and bacon that Billy prepared with surprising skill. As they ate by lamplight, Billy chattered about his plans for the cabin, for the garden he wanted to plant, for the carpentry projects they could work on together. "Could we make a rocking chair?" he asked between bites. Mrs. Crawford had one, and she said it was the most peaceful thing in the world, rocking and watching the sunset. "Rocking chairs are complicated," Tobias warned. "Gotta get the curves just right or they'll tip over backward. But you know how, right? You could teach me?" There was such hope in the question, such faith that Tobias would be around long enough to see a complicated project through to completion. It occurred to him that Billy was betting his future on a man who'd never successfully finished anything in his adult life. "We'll see," he said, which seemed to satisfy Billy completely. As the days passed, they fell into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. Tobias would take whatever work he could find in town, day labor at the mill, repairs for shopkeepers, odd jobs that kept food on their table, while Billy attended the makeshift school that had been set up in the church basement after the fire. Evenings were spent working on small carpentry projects, Billy learning to handle tools, while Tobias rediscovered skills he'd thought were lost forever. The boy proved to be a quick study and an eager student. His small hands learned to guide a plane, to set a nail square, to sand wood smooth without gouging the grain. He asked endless questions about joinery and grain direction and the proper way to sharpen a chisel, absorbing information like parched earth soaking up rain. More importantly, Billy seemed to understand that Tobias was fighting battles that had nothing to do with carpentry. On the nights when grief hit hardest, when memories of Anna's last words or the weight of his failures made concentration impossible, Billy would simply work quietly beside him, offering the gift of undemanding companionship. "You ever think about Anna?" Billy asked one evening as they sat on the porch whittling by lamplight. "Every day," Tobias admitted. "Good things or sad things?" "Both. Mostly sad, I guess." Billy was quiet for a long moment, his knife working carefully around a difficult knot in the wood. Mrs. Crawford used to say that remembering people was a way of keeping them alive. Like as long as we thought about them and talked about them, they weren't really gone. What do you think about that? I think it's probably true. I still talk to my ma and pa sometimes when nobody else is around. Tell them about school and about you and about the things I'm learning. Makes me feel better, like they're still watching out for me somehow. That night, for the first time since the fire, Tobias tried talking to Anna. Not the desperate, guilt-ridden pleading he'd been carrying around like stones in his pockets, but the kind of gentle conversation a father might have with a daughter at bedtime. He told her about Billy, about the cabin, about how her friend was growing into a fine young man who asked thoughtful questions and treated every lesson like a precious gift. He told her about the rocking chair they were planning to build, about the garden Billy wanted to plant come spring, about how her death had somehow created a space for life to grow again. He couldn't be sure, but it seemed like the weight on his chest grew a little lighter, as if Anna approved of the way her story was continuing through Billy's presence. The boy was right, Tobias realized. Memory could be a prison or a garden, depending on how you tended it. And maybe, just maybe, the best way to honor the daughter he'd lost was to do right by the son he'd found. 3 months after the fire, Sheriff Mills pinned a deputy's badge to Tobias's shirt and handed him the keys to the town jail. The badge felt heavier than it had any right to, as if it were made of lead instead of tin. Weighted with expectations and second chances he wasn't sure he deserved. Town council voted unanimous, Mills explained, settling back behind his desk with obvious relief. "You've proved yourself, Fletcher. That business at the orphanage showed folks what kind of man you really are." Tobias fingered the badge, remembering other tin stars he'd worn in other lifetimes, back when he'd believed in law and order and the possibility that good men could make a difference in a hard world. That faith had died somewhere in the trenches of his own failures, buried under 3 years of whiskey and self-pity. "I'm not sure I'm the right man for this," he said honestly. "Maybe not," Mills agreed with a shrug. "But you're the man we've got. Besides, this town's seen what you'll do when children are in danger. That counts for more than experience in my book. The job came with a small salary and a tiny office adjacent to the jail cells. Barely large enough for a desk and chair, but private enough for Billy to do his homework, while Tobias handled the evening rounds. More importantly, it came with respectability, the kind of steady employment that let a man hold his head up in public and plan more than a day ahead. Billy was thrilled with the arrangement, proudly telling anyone who'd listen that his guardian was now a lawman. The boy had grown taller over the winter months, filling out with regular meals and the security of knowing where he'd sleep each night. His natural intelligence, freed from the anxiety of survival, had begun to flourish in ways that surprised even his makeshift schoolteacher, Billy's reading at a level well beyond his years. Helen Barstow reported during one of their increasingly frequent conversations. Helen had taken over teaching duties when the previous schoolmaster left for opportunities in Denver, and her gentle competence with the children had quickly made her indispensable to the community. He asks good questions too, she continued, settling into the chair across from Tobias's desk, while Billy worked at solving arithmetic problems in the corner. Yesterday, he wanted to know why some words are spelled differently than they sound, and when I explained about word origins, he started making connections I hadn't expected from someone his age. Tobias looked over at Billy, who was frowning with concentration as he worked through a particularly challenging problem. The boy's tongue stuck out slightly when he was thinking hard, a habit that reminded Tobias painfully of Anna at the same age. "He's got a quick mind," Tobias agreed. "Always did, even back at the orphanage. Used to watch me work and pick up techniques after seeing them once." "He talks about you constantly," Helen said with a smile. "Tobias showed me this, Tobias taught me that." "You've become quite the hero in his eyes." The word hero still made Tobias uncomfortable. Heroes didn't let their daughters die. Heroes didn't spend years drowning in bottles while children waited for rescue. But he was learning to accept Billy's admiration without the crushing weight of unworthiness that used to accompany any praise. "He's easy to teach," Tobias said instead. "Pays attention. Doesn't give up when things get difficult, unlike some adults I could mention," Helen observed with gentle teasing. She'd been coming by the office more frequently lately, ostensibly to discuss Billy's education, but lingering for conversations that ranged far beyond lesson plans. Helen was a widow herself, her husband lost to a mining accident 2 years prior, and she understood something about rebuilding life from ashes and fragments. There was kindness in her brown eyes, and a strength that came from facing grief and choosing to continue anyway. She was perhaps 30 years old, with prematurely grey threads in her auburn hair, and laugh lines that spoke of someone determined to find joy despite loss. "Mrs. Barstow," Billy said suddenly, looking up from his arithmetic, "do you think Tobias is getting better?" "Better how?" she asked gently, at being happy. "He still gets sad sometimes, especially when he thinks I'm not looking. But he smiles more now than when we first moved to the cabin." Helen glanced at Tobias, who felt heat rise in his cheeks at being discussed so frankly. But there was no judgment in her expression, only understanding. "I think your guardian is learning something important," she told Billy. "Sometimes when people lose someone they love very much, they think the only way to honor that person's memory is to stay sad forever. But the people who love us want us to find happiness again, don't they?" Billy nodded seriously. "Anna used to say that. She said her mama would want her papa to smile again someday." The casual mention of his daughter still hit Tobias like a physical blow, but he was learning to ride out the pain instead of drowning it in alcohol. Anna had said that? Had his 8-year-old daughter understood things about grief and healing that had taken him 3 years to begin learning? That evening, after Helen had gone home and Billy was asleep on his cot by the fireplace, Tobias walked through the quiet streets of Millbrook on his regular patrol. The town was settling into winter, windows glowing with lamplight, smoke rising from chimneys into the star-filled sky. It was peaceful in a way that still surprised him, this sense of belonging somewhere, of having responsibilities that mattered to people he cared about. As he passed the charred remains of the orphanage, Tobias found himself stopping as he did most nights. The debris had been cleared away months ago, leaving only a foundation and the blackened skeleton of a few support beams. But someone, probably Mrs. Crawford, had planted wildflower seeds in the ashes, and even in winter the dried stems created a kind of memorial garden. "I'm trying, Anna," he said quietly, his breath making small clouds in the cold air. "I know I'm not much of a father to Billy, but I'm trying to be better than I was. He's a good boy. Reminds me of you sometimes, the way he thinks about things, the way he never gives up." A coyote called somewhere out in the hills, a lonesome sound that seemed to echo the ache that still lived in Tobias's chest. But tonight the ache felt different somehow. Less like a wound that would never heal, and more like a permanent sadness he could learn to carry without being crushed by it. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Though Tobias didn't know it yet, he was teaching Billy how to mortise a joint when Sheriff Mills burst through the office door, his face grim with urgency. "We've got a problem," Mills announced without preamble. "Federal marshals in town asking questions about the orphanage fire. Says they have reason to believe it wasn't an accident." "What kind of questions?" Tobias asked, though his stomach was already tightening with dread. "The kind that suggest somebody set that fire on purpose. And the kind that suggest whoever did it might not be finished with their business in Millbrook." Billy looked up from his woodworking with wide eyes, the chisel forgotten in his small hands. "You mean someone wanted to hurt the children?" "We don't know anything for certain yet," Mills said carefully. "But I want you both to be extra careful until we figure out what's what. Lock your doors at night and don't go anywhere alone." As Mills left to continue his investigation, Tobias felt the fragile peace he'd been building crack like ice under pressure. He'd thought the worst was behind them, that the tragedy was just that, a terrible accident that had claimed innocent lives, but was finished claiming them. But if someone had deliberately set that fire, if Anna's death hadn't been the random cruelty of fate, but the calculated evil of human intention, then everything changed. The grief he'd been learning to carry became rage. The healing he'd been working toward became a luxury he couldn't afford. Because if someone had murdered his daughter, they were going to answer for it. And this time, Tobias Fletcher was going to make sure he didn't fail. The federal marshal was a lean man with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of whatever room he entered. Marshal Theodore Grant had arrived on the morning stage, carrying himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to asking uncomfortable questions and receiving honest answers. "Fire started in 3 separate locations," he explained to Tobias and Sheriff Mills as they stood in his makeshift office at the hotel. "Kitchen, main hall, and the storage room upstairs. That's not how accidental fires behave, gentlemen." "That's arson." Tobias felt his jaw clench involuntarily. "You're certain?" "As certain as 20 years of investigating suspicious fires can make a man," Grant replied. "Someone wanted that building to burn fast and complete. They used lamp oil as an accelerant and timed it for maximum impact. Evening meal, when all the children would be inside and the staff would be in town. Any idea who might have done such a thing?" Mills asked, though his voice suggested he already suspected the answer wouldn't be simple. "That's what I'm here to find out." Grant pulled out a leather notebook and flipped through several pages. "I've been asking around town about anyone with grievances against the orphanage, anyone who might benefit from its destruction. Interesting things come to light when you start asking the right questions." He fixed his gaze on Tobias. "You're the man who rescued those children. Hell of a thing charging into a burning building like that. Takes either tremendous courage or tremendous guilt to attempt something that dangerous." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Tobias forced himself to meet Grant's stare directly. "Are you suggesting I had something to do with starting that fire?" "I'm suggesting that in my experience, the person who discovers a crime and the person who commits it are sometimes the same individual. Hero and villain trying to cover their tracks by playing savior." Sheriff Mills stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation. "Now see here, Marshal, it's all right," Tobias said quietly. He understood the logic. A drunk, desperate man with a history of failure might indeed set a fire and then attempt rescue to assuage his guilt. It was the kind of twisted reasoning that made sense if you didn't know about Anna, didn't understand that no father would deliberately endanger his own child. "My daughter died in that fire," he told Grant simply. "I didn't know she was there, hadn't seen her in 3 years. But she was one of the children I tried to save, and she died anyway. You think I'd have risked that if I'd had any part in setting the blaze?" Something in Grant's expression shifted slightly. "Your daughter?" "Anna Fletcher, 8 years old. She'd been living with her aunt in Kansas City until the woman took sick. Mrs. Crawford placed her at the orphanage in the spring, but I didn't know. Hadn't been much of a father since my wife died. Hadn't kept in touch like I should have." Grant made a note in his book, but his tone became less accusatory. I'm sorry for your loss, but you understand why I had to ask? I understand. What I want to know is who did set that fire and what you're going to do about it. That depends on what evidence I can uncover. Tell me, either of you know anything about a man named Edgar Vance? Owns the general store, sits on the town council. Mills and Tobias exchanged glances. Vance was one of Millbrook's more prosperous citizens, a shrewd businessman who'd managed to thrive even as the town struggled with drought and economic hardship. What about him? Mills asked carefully. He's been buying up property around town at well below market value, particularly properties that have suffered some kind of misfortune, fire, flood, foreclosure. Always seems to know about opportunities before anyone else does. That's just good business sense, Mills protested, though he sounded less certain than his words suggested. Maybe. Or maybe it's something else entirely. Grant consulted his notes again. The orphanage sat on prime real estate. Close to town center, big lot, good access to the main road. Property like that would be valuable to someone with plans for development. Development. Tobias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November weather. Railroad's been surveying through this area. Rumor is they're planning a depot somewhere in the valley, maybe a freight yard. That orphanage lot would be perfect for commercial development if someone could acquire it cheap enough. The implications hit Tobias like a physical blow. If Grant was right, Anna and the other children hadn't died in a tragic accident. They'd been murdered for money, killed so someone could profit from their graves. You have proof of any of this? He asked, his voice tight with controlled fury. Not yet, but I'm working on it. In the meantime, I'd appreciate if you gentlemen would keep your ears open. Sometimes the truth has a way of surfacing when people think nobody's listening. That afternoon, Tobias walked through town with new eyes, studying the faces of neighbors he'd thought he knew. Was Edgar Vance really capable of mass murder for profit? The man seemed ordinary enough, middle-aged, soft around the middle, more concerned with ledger books than violence. But Tobias had learned that evil didn't always announce itself with horns and pitchforks. He found Billy at Helen's house, working on lessons at her kitchen table while she prepared the evening meal. The domestic scene was so peaceful, so normal, that for a moment Tobias hesitated to disturb it with talk of murder and corruption. How did school go today? He asked instead, settling into a chair beside Billy. Good. Mrs. Barstow showed me how to work with fractions. Turns out they're just another way of describing parts of wholes, like when you're measuring wood for cuts. Helen smiled at this practical application of mathematics. Billy has a gift for making connections between different ideas. It's quite remarkable. Mrs. Barstow, Billy said suddenly, do you think bad people look different from good people? Like, could you tell just by looking at someone whether they might hurt children? The question caught both adults off guard. Helen glanced at Tobias, who realized that Billy had been listening more carefully than anyone had assumed. Why do you ask? Helen said gently, I heard some men talking at Miller's store. They said the fire wasn't an accident, that someone set it on purpose. I keep thinking about that night, trying to remember if I saw anything strange. Tobias leaned forward. What kind of strange things? Billy frowned with concentration. There was a man outside the orphanage earlier that day. I saw him from the upstairs window when I was helping Mrs. Crawford hang laundry. He was walking around the building looking at it real careful like. Can you describe him? He was kind of short and round with a beard. And he walked funny, like one leg was shorter than the other, or maybe it hurt him. He kept looking up at the windows and walking around to the back where the kitchen was. Tobias felt his pulse quicken. Edgar Vance walked with a pronounced limp, the result of a childhood accident that had left his left leg slightly shorter than his right. Did you tell Mrs. Crawford about seeing this man? Billy shook his head. She was busy getting ready to go to town for supplies. Besides, people walked by the orphanage all the time. I didn't think it was important, but it was important. Crucially important. Billy had witnessed someone scouting the orphanage on the day of the fire, someone who matched Edgar Vance's description perfectly. Billy, Tobias said carefully, I need you to think hard about this. Are you certain about what you saw? The marshal will want to talk to you, and it's important that you only tell him what you actually remember, not what you think you might have seen." "I remember," Billy said with the confidence of childhood. "Anna was with me at the window. She saw him too. She said he looked like he was up to no good, but I told her she was being silly." The mention of Anna made Tobias's chest tighten, but this time the pain was mixed with something else, a fierce, protective anger that burned cleaner than grief. "What else do you remember about that day?" The man had a cloth bag with him. It looked heavy, like it had bottles in it or something, and when he walked away, he went toward Mr. Vance's store instead of toward the main road. Helen had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm. "Tobias, if this man Billy saw really was Edgar Vance, and if he really did set that fire, then he murdered 6 children for money," Tobias finished grimly. "And he's been sitting in church every Sunday since, accepting condolences for the community's loss." The thought made him sick with rage, while Tobias had been drowning in guilt and grief, convinced that Anna's death was somehow his fault for not being a better father. The real killer had been walking free, probably planning his next profitable tragedy. That evening, after returning Billy to their cabin with strict instructions to keep the doors locked, Tobias met with Marshal Grant at the hotel. The federal officer listened intently as Tobias relayed Billy's testimony, making careful notes and asking pointed questions about times and details. "This boy," Grant said when Tobias had finished, "how reliable is his memory? Children sometimes see things that aren't there, or remember things differently than they actually happened. Billy's got the sharpest mind of any child I've known," Tobias replied. "He notices things, remembers details. If he says he saw Edgar Vance scouting the orphanage, I believe him, even if it means your daughter was murdered by someone you've been living alongside for months." The question hit hard, but Tobias didn't flinch, especially then. Anna deserves justice, and so do those other children. If Vance killed them, he needs to answer for it, Grant nodded slowly. "I'll need to interview the boy officially, but based on what you've told me, I think we have enough to start asking Edgar Vance some hard questions. The problem is, men like Vance don't stay in business as long as he has without learning how to cover their tracks." "What do you mean?" "I mean that even if we can prove he scouted the building, that's not the same as proving he set the fire. And even if we can prove he set the fire, we'd need to establish motive, show that he stood to gain from the orphanage's destruction." "What about the railroad development you mentioned?" "Rumors and speculation. Vance is too smart to leave documents lying around that connect him directly to any railroad deals. We'll need either a confession or a witness who can place him at the scene during the actual fire." Tobias felt frustration building in his chest. After all these months of grief and self-blame, to learn that Anna's killer was walking free just blocks away, it was almost unbearable. "There has to be something," he said. "Some way to get him to reveal himself." "Maybe there is," Grant said thoughtfully. "But it would require patience and careful planning, and it might put you and the boy at risk." "What kind of risk?" "The kind that comes from a desperate man realizing his secrets are about to be exposed. If Vance really is our killer, and if he suspects we're closing in on him, he might decide to eliminate witnesses before they can testify." The words sent ice through Tobias's veins. Billy had already survived one attempt on his life. The idea that he might be in danger again because of what he'd witnessed. "I won't let anything happen to Billy," Tobias said firmly. "Whatever it takes." "I believe you," Grant replied. "The question is whether you're willing to help me set a trap for Edgar Vance. Because if we're going to catch this man, we're going to need him to believe he's safe right up until the moment we spring the snare." Outside the hotel window, snow was beginning to fall, covering Millbrook in a blanket of deceptive purity. But beneath that clean white surface, Tobias knew corruption was still rotting away at the foundations of everything decent people had tried to build. Anna's killer was still free, but not if Tobias had anything to say about it for much longer. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a nervous boy from the depot who seemed eager to escape Tobias's presence as quickly as possible. The message was brief, written in the clipped language of official business. But its contents hit Tobias like a lightning strike. Stop investigation immediately. Stop Vance connected to Territorial Railroad Commission. Stop federal protection compromised. Stop trust. No one. Stop M. Fletcher Tobias read the message 3 times before the full implications sank in. Monsieur Fletcher, Marcus Fletcher, his brother, whom he hadn't seen or heard from in over 5 years, whom he'd assumed was either dead or had simply decided that Tobias was too much of a failure to bother with. But Marcus was alive, and somehow he knew about the investigation into the orphanage fire. More disturbing, he was warning Tobias that Edgar Vance had connections reaching all the way to the territorial government, connections powerful enough to compromise federal marshals. Bad news? Sheriff Mills asked, noticing Tobias's expression as he entered the office. I'm not sure, Tobias replied honestly. He folded the telegram carefully and slipped it into his vest pocket. Has Marshal Grant said anything about wrapping up his investigation? Matter of fact, he has. Came by this morning to say he's heading back to Denver tomorrow. Claims he can't find enough evidence to pursue charges against anyone. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. Someone had gotten to Grant, convinced him to abandon his investigation just as they were getting close to the truth. The question was whether that someone was Edgar Vance or somebody even more powerful. That afternoon, Tobias made his decision. He left Billy with Helen, claiming he had business to attend to, and rode out of town toward the old mining camp where Marcus had worked the last time they'd been in contact. It was a long shot. His brother could be anywhere by now. But the telegram had been sent from Prospect Falls, just 20 miles north of Millbrook. The ride through the mountain passes gave Tobias time to think about his relationship with Marcus. They'd never been close, even as children. Marcus was 3 years older, smarter, more ambitious, everything their worthless father wasn't. While Tobias had drifted from job to job after their father's death, Marcus had educated himself, worked his way up, from miner to surveyor to something approaching respectability. The last time they'd spoken, Marcus had offered to help Tobias get back on his feet after Mary's death. But Tobias had been too proud, too wrapped up in his grief and self-pity to accept assistance from a brother who seemed to have everything figured out. They'd parted in anger, and Tobias had assumed that was the end of it. Now, it seemed, Marcus had been watching from a distance all along. Prospect Falls was a dying town, its silver mines played out and half its buildings abandoned to the weather. But the remaining residents directed Tobias to a small cabin on the outskirts, where smoke rose from the chimney and a familiar figure sat on the porch, waiting. Marcus Fletcher had aged in the 5 years since Tobias had last seen him, his dark hair now streaked with silver, and his face lined with the kind of worry that came from carrying other people's secrets. But his eyes were the same, sharp, intelligent, always calculating the angles. Took you long enough, Marcus said by way of greeting. I was beginning to think you hadn't gotten my message. Got it, Tobias replied, dismounting and tying his horse to the porch rail. What I didn't get was how you knew to send it. Sit down, brother. We need to talk, and some of what I'm going to tell you isn't going to be easy to hear. They settled into chairs on either side of a small table, and Marcus poured coffee from a pot that had been waiting. For a moment, they could have been any 2 brothers catching up on family news, except for the tension that crackled between them like electricity before a storm. How long have you known about Anna? Tobias asked finally. Marcus winced as if the question were a physical blow. Since the day Margaret Kellins died, the consumption took her faster than anyone expected, and she made me promise on her deathbed that I'd look after Anna if anything happened to you. She knew about you. Margaret knew you were keeping track of us. I was the one who arranged for Anna's care in the first place, Marcus admitted quietly. After Mary died and you disappeared into that bottle, I couldn't just stand by and watch my niece suffer for your failures. So I contacted Margaret, offered to pay for Anna's expenses if she'd take the girl. The revelation hit Tobias like a physical blow. All this time, he'd assumed Margaret had taken Anna out of family duty, had resented the burden his failures had placed on her. But Marcus had been pulling strings behind the scenes, ensuring Anna was cared for while keeping himself invisible. When Margaret's health started failing, she wrote to me about placing Anna somewhere safe. I researched children's homes throughout the territory and recommended the Millbrook Orphanage. Mrs. Crawford had an excellent reputation. The town seemed stable and— Marcus paused, his face darkening with guilt. And I thought being in the same town as you might eventually lead to some kind of reconciliation. You knew I was in Millbrook? I've kept track of you for years, Tobias. Every job you took, every town you drifted through. I kept hoping you'd sober up enough to be a father to that little girl, but you never did. When Anna was placed at the orphanage, I thought maybe proximity would force you to face your responsibilities. Tobias felt rage building in his chest, but it was complicated by grief and something that might have been gratitude. So Anna died because you were playing puppet master with our lives? Anna died because Edgar Vance set fire to that orphanage, Marcus replied sharply. But yes, she was there because of decisions I made. You think I don't know that? You think I don't carry that guilt every waking moment? Tell me about Vance. Marcus pulled out a leather portfolio and spread several documents across the table. Maps, surveys, official correspondence, all bearing the seals of the Territorial Railroad Commission. Vance isn't just a small-town storekeeper, Marcus explained. He's a front man for a consortium of investors planning to build a major railroad depot in this valley. They've been buying up property for months, usually through intermediaries, so the connection isn't obvious, and the orphanage sat right where they wanted to build. Not just where they wanted to build, where they had to build. The geography of the valley funnels all rail traffic through a narrow corridor, and the orphanage property was the only suitable location for a freight yard and switching station. Tobias studied the maps, seeing how the proposed rail lines converged exactly where Mrs. Crawford's small building had stood. So they burned it down for a railroad depot? They burned it down because Mrs. Crawford refused to sell. She'd been approached multiple times with increasingly generous offers, but she kept refusing. Said the children needed stability and she wouldn't uproot them for money. Couldn't they have built somewhere else? Not without spending 10 times as much on earthwork and engineering. The orphanage lot was perfect. Level ground, good drainage, easy access to the main roads. Mrs. Crawford's refusal to sell was the only thing standing between them and millions of dollars in profit. Marcus gathered up the documents and returned them to his portfolio. I've been investigating this consortium for months, trying to build a case that would hold up in territorial court. But they have connections everywhere, judges, territorial officials, even federal marshals. Every time I get close to exposing them, someone with more authority shuts down the investigation, like what happened with Grant. Exactly like what happened with Grant. He received orders from Washington to abandon his inquiry and return to Denver immediately. No explanation, no appeal process. Tobias felt the weight of impossible odds settling on his shoulders. If Marcus was right, they weren't just facing a local murderer, but an entire network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. What about justice for Anna? He asked quietly. I don't know, Marcus admitted. These people have too much money, too much influence. They can buy judges, silence witnesses, make evidence disappear. A regular court case might be impossible, but there's another way. Marcus met his eyes directly. There might be. But it would be dangerous, and it would require both of us working together. Are you willing to do that, Tobias? Are you willing to trust me after all these years? Tobias thought about Anna, about the trust in her eyes as he'd lowered her from that burning window. About Billy, sleeping peacefully in their cabin, believing the adults in his world would keep him safe. About all the children who might die in future accidents if men like Edgar Vance were allowed to operate with impunity. What did you have in mind? He asked. Marcus smiled grimly. I have something they want more than railroad property. Something they'd kill for if they knew I had it. We're going to use that as bait to draw them into the open, where we can expose them to people they can't buy or intimidate. What kind of bait? The kind that proves their guilt beyond any doubt, Marcus replied. But first, we need to make them believe they're safe. And that means you need to go back to Millbrook and act like you've given up on finding Anna's killer. It was the hardest thing Tobias had ever been asked to return to his daily routine while Anna's murderers walked free, to smile and nod and pretend that justice didn't matter. But if it meant catching the men responsible for his daughter's death, he'd play whatever role was necessary, even if it meant becoming the kind of man who could plan cold revenge while teaching a boy to whittle wooden horses. The plan Marcus had devised was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its risks. For 2 weeks, Tobias played his assigned role perfectly, the grieving father who'd finally accepted that his daughter's death was just a tragic accident. The reformed drunk who was more concerned with building a life with Billy than pursuing impossible vengeance. He made a point of being seen around town, conducting his deputy duties with calm efficiency, even sharing pleasantries with Edgar Vance when their paths crossed at Miller's store. To all appearances, Tobias Fletcher had made peace with his loss and moved on. Meanwhile, Marcus worked behind the scenes, using his connections in the Territorial Surveyor's office to gather the evidence they'd need. The plan hinged on a single, crucial document, a telegram that Marcus had intercepted months earlier, sent from Edgar Vance to his consortium partners in Denver. The message was brief but damning. Obstacle removed. Property available for immediate acquisition. It had been sent the morning after the fire, and it would be enough to hang Vance if they could get it before the right authorities. The problem was that those authorities had to be beyond the reach of the consortium's corruption, which meant bypassing the entire territorial justice system and appealing directly to federal investigators in Washington. There's a U.S. Attorney General Inspector coming through the territory next month, Marcus explained during one of their secret meetings at an abandoned mine shaft outside town. Samuel Morrison, career federal prosecutor with a reputation for integrity. If we can get this evidence to him personally, he'll have the authority to launch a full federal investigation. And if the consortium discovers what we're doing before Morrison arrives. Marcus's expression was grim. Then we'll likely end up in unmarked graves somewhere in these mountains, and Billy will be next on their list. The thought of Billy in danger was almost unbearable. The boy had grown so much over the winter months, not just physically but emotionally. He'd begun to trust again, to believe in the possibility of permanent family, of a future that extended beyond mere survival. The idea that Tobias's quest for justice might destroy that security felt like another kind of failure. But Anna deserved justice, and other children deserved protection from men who would murder them for money. As the weeks passed, the strain of maintaining his deception began to wear on Tobias. He found himself snapping at Billy over minor issues, losing focus during conversations with Helen, drinking slightly more than was wise, though still far from his old destructive patterns. "Are you feeling all right?" Helen asked one evening as they sat on her porch, watching Billy play with other children in the yard. "You seem distant lately, like you're carrying some burden you won't share." "Just tired," Tobias lied. "Winter's been long, and I'm looking forward to spring." She studied his face with the kind of perception that came from caring deeply about someone. "It's about Anna, isn't it? You're still blaming yourself for what happened, if only it were that simple." Self-blame was a luxury compared to the knowledge that your daughter's killers were walking free, planning their next profitable tragedy, while you pretended to be at peace with injustice. "Some things can't be fixed with time and good intentions," he said finally. "No," Helen agreed softly. "But some things can be healed with love and patience, if you let them." She reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm against his calloused palm. For a moment, Tobias allowed himself to imagine a different life, one where he could accept the love she was offering, where he could focus on building happiness instead of pursuing vengeance. But Anna's face haunted him, and the weight of Marcus's intercepted telegram seemed to burn in his coat pocket like a coal from hell. 3 days before Inspector Morrison was scheduled to arrive in the territorial capital, everything went wrong. Tobias was in his office, reviewing patrol schedules with Sheriff Mills, When Billy burst through the door, with tears streaming down his face and terror in his eyes, they took her. He gasped between sobs. They took Mrs. Barstow. Tobias was on his feet instantly, his heart hammering against his ribs. Who took her? Where? Two men with guns. They came to the schoolhouse during afternoon lessons. They said if you didn't stop poking around in things that weren't your business, they'd hurt her. They said they'd send word about where to meet them. Sheriff Mills cursed under his breath. This is about that orphanage business, isn't it? I told you to let sleeping dogs lie. But Tobias was already moving, checking his gun and grabbing his coat. Whoever had taken Helen knew about his investigation, which meant either Marcus had been compromised or someone had been watching them more carefully than they'd realized. Billy, I need you to stay here with Sheriff Mills. Don't go anywhere alone. And don't trust anyone, except people you know absolutely. But what about Mrs. Barstow? What if they hurt her? They won't, Tobias said with more confidence than he felt. Helen's their leverage. As long as I do what they want, she'll be safe. The message came 2 hours later, delivered by the same nervous telegraph boy who'd brought Marcus's first warning. The instructions were specific. Come alone to the old Hendricks mine at midnight. Bring any documents or evidence related to the orphanage fire and be prepared to make a deal. Tobias knew it was a trap. They had no intention of trading Helen's life for his silence. They planned to kill them both and eliminate the threat permanently. But he also knew he had no choice. He couldn't let Helen die because of his quest for justice, couldn't let another innocent person pay the price for his failures. He spent the evening making arrangements. A letter to Marcus, explaining what had happened and where he was going. Instructions for Billy's care if things went badly. A will leaving his few possessions to the boy who'd become more important to him than his own life. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky the color of dried blood, Tobias saddled his horse and prepared to ride toward what was almost certainly his own death. But as he mounted up, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows beside the stable. Going somewhere, brother? Marcus stepped into the lamplight, armed and ready for trouble. Behind him came 3 other men, hard-faced individuals with the look of professional gunfighters. How did you... I've been watching the town since we made our agreement, Marcus replied. When I saw suspicious activity around the schoolhouse, I figured our timeline had just accelerated. They have Helen. I have to go to them. We have to go to them, Marcus corrected. This was always going to end in confrontation, Tobias. The only question was whether we'd choose the time and place or let them choose it for us. If we go in shooting, they'll kill her before we can reach her. Maybe, but if you go alone, they'll definitely kill both of you. At least this way, we have a fighting chance. Marcus introduced his companions, ex-military men like himself, soldiers turned investigators who specialized in cases the regular law couldn't handle. They'd been tracking the railroad consortium for months, building cases in multiple territories, waiting for the right moment to strike. This could be that moment, Marcus explained, as they rode toward the mining camp. If we can take Vance and his partners alive, get them to talk, we might be able to bring down the entire network. And if we can't, then we make sure they can't hurt anyone else ever again. The Hendricks mine sat in a narrow valley, surrounded by steep slopes that offered both concealment and danger. Tobias had worked these mountains long enough to know their geography, to understand how sound carried in the thin air, and where a man might take cover if shooting started. They approached carefully, leaving their horses a mile away and proceeding on foot. Marcus's men were professionals, moving with the silent efficiency of soldiers who'd done this kind of work before. But Tobias found himself thinking less about tactics and more about Helen, wondering if she was afraid, if she understood that he would never have let her be taken if he'd had any choice in the matter. As they crested the ridge overlooking the mine, Tobias could see the glow of lanterns below. Several figures moved around a makeshift camp, and he could make out Helen's form tied to a post near the main building. She appeared unharmed but frightened, and the sight of her filled him with a cold fury that burned cleaner than anything he'd felt since Anna's death. "There's Vance," Marcus whispered, pointing to a round figure directing the other men. And those two with him are the muscle the consortium uses for situations like this. Professional killers, both of them. How do you want to do this? Marcus studied the camp through a pair of field glasses, calculating angles and approaches. Simple. We get close enough to guarantee Helen's safety, then we give them a choice. Surrender and face federal justice, or die right here in these mountains. They won't surrender. Probably not. But we'll have offered them the chance. As they prepared to descend toward the camp, Tobias felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. For months, he'd been carrying the weight of Anna's death, the guilt of his failures as a father, the rage of knowing her killers walked free. Tonight, one way or another, that burden would be lifted. Either he would succeed in bringing Anna's murderers to justice, or he would die trying. Both outcomes seemed preferable to the limbo he'd been living in. The half-life of a man who'd lost everything that mattered and didn't know how to build anything new from the ashes. But as they moved toward the confrontation below, Tobias found himself thinking not just of Anna but of Billy, waiting back in town with Sheriff Mills, trusting that the man he'd come to see as a father would find a way to come home safely. That trust, Tobias realized, might be the most precious thing he'd ever been given. And he was about to risk losing it forever in pursuit of justice for a daughter who was already beyond his help. But some debts could only be paid in blood, and some promises could only be kept through sacrifice. Tonight, in the cold mountains of Colorado Territory, Tobias Fletcher would finally learn which kind of man he really was. The descent toward the mining camp took 20 minutes of careful movement through loose shale and scrub pine, every step calculated to avoid the cascade of rocks that would announce their presence. Marcus's men moved like ghosts, their military training evident in the way they used terrain and shadows to remain invisible. As they drew closer, Tobias could hear voices carrying on the thin mountain air. Edgar Vance was arguing with someone, his normally oily tones sharp with anxiety. "Told you this should have been handled months ago." Fletcher was supposed to drink himself to death, like any decent failure. "Now look where we are." "Shut up, Vance." The second voice belonged to a man Tobias didn't recognize, someone with the flat, emotionless tone of professional violence. "Your job was to acquire the property. My job is to clean up messes. Let me do what I do best." "What about the woman?" "She's seen our faces. She won't be seeing anything much longer. Neither will Fletcher once he arrives with whatever evidence he thinks he has." Tobias felt his jaw clench at the casual discussion of Helen's murder. Around Anna's silver cross, which he'd taken to wearing inside his shirt, his chest burned with righteous fury. Marcus caught his eye and held up 5 fingers, then pointed to different positions around the camp. 5 men total, counting Vance. 2 professional gunmen, Vance himself, and 2 others who looked like local hired muscle. The odds weren't impossible, but they weren't good either. Through hand signals, Marcus deployed his men to strategic positions. The plan was simple. Wait for Tobias to enter the camp as expected, then move simultaneously to neutralize the threats while keeping Helen safe. At 5 minutes before midnight, Tobias walked his horse down the final slope toward the camp, his hands visible and empty of weapons. He'd hidden his gun in his saddlebag, playing the role of a desperate man, more concerned with Helen's safety than his own survival. "Fletcher!" Vance called out as Tobias approached the circle of lantern light. "Right on time. I do appreciate punctuality in a man." Up close, Edgar Vance looked different than he did behind his store counter. The jovial merchant's mask had been replaced by something harder, more calculating. This was a man who could order children burned alive and sleep soundly afterward. "Let me see that she's unharmed," Tobias said. Dismounting slowly, Helen was tied to a wooden post near the mine entrance, her wrists bound behind her back, but otherwise uninjured. When she saw Tobias, relief flooded her face, followed quickly by fear. "I'm sorry," she said. "They were waiting at the school. I tried to run." "Enough!" snapped the taller of the 2 gunmen. This was clearly the leader, a lean man with dead eyes and scars that spoke of violence as a profession. "You brought the documents, Fletcher." "I brought them." Tobias patted his coat pocket. "Letters, telegrams, survey maps. Everything that connects Vance to the orphanage fire and the railroad consortium. Smart man. Hand them over after you release Mrs. Barstow. The gunman smiled without humor. I don't think you understand how this works, Fletcher. You don't make demands. You follow orders, or the lady pays for your stubbornness. He drew his pistol and pointed it at Helen's head, the metal gleaming in the lantern light. Helen closed her eyes, her lips moving in what might have been a prayer. "All right," Tobias said quickly. "All right, you win." He reached into his coat, fingers closing around the packet of papers Marcus had prepared, authentic-looking documents that would fool casual inspection but contained nothing actually damaging to their operation. As he withdrew the packet, he let Anna's silver cross slip free of his shirt, catching the lantern light. "What's that around your neck?" Vance asked suddenly. "Nothing important. Let me see it." Tobias lifted the cross, letting Vance get a good look at the delicate silver chain and the small locket attached to it. "That belonged to one of the children in the fire," Vance said slowly. "Little girl named Anna. I remember her, pretty thing. Reminded me of my own daughter at that age." The casual mention of Anna, spoken as if she were just another obstacle overcome, shattered something inside Tobias. All pretense of negotiation vanished, replaced by pure, deadly intent. "She was my daughter," he said quietly. Vance's face went pale as the implications sank in. "Your daughter? But that's impossible. You were just some drunk cowboy who charged into a burning building to save his child," Tobias finished. "The child you murdered for railroad money." The camp fell silent, except for the hiss of burning lanterns and the whisper of wind through the mountain pines. Even the professional killers seemed taken aback by the naked hatred in Tobias's voice. "It was business," Vance said weakly. "Nothing personal. The property had to be acquired, and Mrs. Crawford wouldn't sell. We tried everything else first. You tried everything except letting children live." Tobias dropped the packet of papers and dove sideways as the first gunshot shattered the mountain silence. The bullet passed through the space where he'd been standing, sparking off rocks behind him as he rolled behind a minecart. Around the camp, Marcus and his men opened fire simultaneously, their rifles spitting flame in the darkness. The professional killers reacted instantly, but they'd been caught off guard by the coordinated attack from multiple directions. Helen screamed as bullets flew overhead, pressing herself against the post she was tied to, trying to make herself as small a target as possible. The gunfight had begun. The mine camp erupted in chaos as gunfire echoed off the mountain walls like thunder. Tobias rolled behind the minecart, his hand closing around the pistol he'd hidden in his boot. Around him, muzzle flashes lit the darkness like deadly fireflies. Marcus and his men had chosen their positions well. From three sides of the camp, rifle fire converged on the hired killers, forcing them to take cover behind stacked timber and abandoned equipment. But these were professional gunmen, and they adapted quickly to the ambush. The tall killer, their leader, barked orders to his companions while laying down covering fire with a repeating rifle that sent splinters flying from the minecart protecting Tobias. "Daniels, get to the woman! She's our ticket out of here!" Tobias saw the second gunman moving toward Helen and knew he had seconds to act. He broke from cover, sprinting across the open ground, while bullets whined around him like angry hornets. The killer called Daniel saw him coming and swung his pistol toward Helen's head. "Stop right there, Fletcher, or she dies." But Tobias was beyond stopping, beyond rational thought. The sight of another innocent person, threatened because of his failures, unleashed something primal in him, something that had been building since the night Anna died in his arms. He dove forward as Daniels fired, feeling the bullet tear through his shoulder as he collided with the gunman. They went down together, rolling in the dirt and gravel. Daniels was younger and stronger, but Tobias fought with the desperate fury of a man who'd lost everything that mattered. They grappled for the gun, grunting and cursing as they rolled dangerously close to Helen's bound form. "Tobias!" Helen cried, straining against her ropes. The distraction cost Daniels his advantage. Tobias managed to drive his knee into the gunman's ribs, loosening his grip on the pistol long enough to tear it away. Without hesitation, he pressed the barrel against Daniels's chest and pulled the trigger. The gunshot was muffled by flesh and bone, but its finality echoed in Tobias's mind as the killer went limp beneath him. He'd taken a life, not in the heat of war or self-defense, but in cold determination to protect someone he loved. "Behind you!" Helen screamed. Tobias spun to see Edgar Vance emerging from behind a stack of lumber, a shotgun in his trembling hands. The storekeeper's face was pale with terror, but his eyes burned with the desperate cunning of a cornered rat. "It's over." "Vance," Tobias said, rising slowly with the pistol trained on the merchant's chest. "Is it?" Vance's voice cracked with hysteria. "You think killing me stops this? The consortium has operations in 6 territories. I'm just one small piece of a very large machine, maybe, but you're the piece that murdered my daughter. Your daughter was an accident. We never meant for children to die. It was supposed to be empty, just a building fire to force the sale." The confession hung in the mountain air like smoke. Around the camp, the gunfire had died to sporadic shots as Marcus and his men finished mopping up the remaining hired muscle. But she wasn't empty, was she? Tobias stepped closer, the pistol never wavering. "Anna was there, waiting for a father who never came. And you burned her alive for railroad money." "Please," Vance whispered. "I have a family. Children of my own. So did Mrs. Crawford. So did all those other parents whose children you murdered." Tobias felt Anna's cross against his chest, warm as a living heart. He could end this now with one pull of the trigger. Justice for his daughter, vengeance for all the innocents. But as his finger tightened on the trigger, he heard another voice, not Anna's, but Billy's. "Will you teach me to make a better one? When you're feeling up to it, I mean. A boy who believed in second chances, who trusted that broken things could be rebuilt, that failed men could become fathers worth following. What would Billy think of a guardian who chose revenge over justice, who became a killer instead of a protector?" "Tobias," Marcus called from across the camp. "It's over. We got them all." Tobias looked at his brother, then at Helen, watching him with eyes full of understanding, then at Edgar Vance, trembling behind his shotgun. The choice was his: become the kind of man who murdered in cold blood, or become the kind of man who chose a harder path. "Drop the gun, Vance," he said finally. "You're going to face trial for what you've done. Federal trial, where your consortium friends can't protect you. And if I refuse, then I'll kill you right here and sleep just fine afterward. But I'd rather see you hang legal, so the world knows what kind of man burns children for profit." Vance's shotgun wavered, then slowly lowered. "You promise me a fair trial, not some frontier lynch mob." "I promise you exactly what you gave my daughter," Tobias replied. "A chance to survive if you're strong enough to take it." The storekeeper's shoulders sagged in defeat. The shotgun fell from his hands, clattering on the rocky ground like the collapse of all his ambitions, as Marcus and his men secured the survivors and tended to Helen's bonds. Tobias walked to the edge of the camp and looked up at the stars scattered across the mountain sky. Somewhere among those distant lights, he hoped Anna could see that her death had finally been answered, not with more death, but with justice. The broken watch in his vest pocket, his father's timepiece that had stopped working years ago, gave a single clear tick in the mountain silence. Time, it seemed, was finally moving forward again. 1 year later, Tobias stood in his best suit at the altar of Millbrook's small church, his hands steady as he waited for Helen to walk down the aisle. The morning sun streamed through windows that had been repaired and polished until they gleamed like jewels, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden pews filled with neighbors who'd become family. Billy sat in the front row, his hair neatly combed and his face bright with excitement. The boy had grown taller over the year, his shoulders broader, but more importantly, the shadows had left his eyes. He'd testified at Edgar Vance's trial with the clear, steady voice of someone who understood the weight of truth. And he'd watched justice served with the satisfaction of a survivor who'd finally seen wrongs made right. The church doors opened, and Helen appeared in a simple white dress that made her look radiant despite the premature silver in her hair. Marcus walked beside her, giving away the bride since her own family was scattered across distant territories. The brothers had reconciled completely over the months of trial preparation, their shared quest for justice healing wounds that had festered for years. As Helen approached the altar, Tobias found himself thinking of Anna, not with the crushing grief that had defined him for so long, but with the gentle sadness of love that transcends death. His daughter would have liked Helen, would have approved of Billy as a brother, would have been proud to see her father choosing happiness over despair. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt, conducted by a circuit preacher who spoke of second chances and new beginnings. When Tobias slipped the ring onto Helen's finger, he felt something shift inside his chest, not the healing of old wounds, but the growth of new strength around them. "You may kiss your bride," the preacher announced, and when Tobias did, the congregation erupted in applause that echoed through the small church like thunder. The celebration afterward was held in the town square, where tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by every family in Millbrook. Children ran between the adults, their laughter bright as birdsong, while musicians played fiddle tunes that set feet tapping despite the afternoon heat. "Speech," someone called, and soon the entire crowd was chanting for Tobias to address them. He stood reluctantly, uncomfortable as always with being the center of attention, but knowing these people deserved his words. They'd supported him through the darkest period of his life, had trusted him with their safety as deputy sheriff, had welcomed his makeshift family without question or judgment. "A year ago," he began, his voice carrying clearly in the still air, "I thought my life was over. I'd lost my daughter, lost my way, lost any reason to believe that tomorrow might be better than yesterday. This town could have turned its back on a worthless drunk who had nothing to offer but broken promises and old mistakes." He paused, looking out at faces that had become dear to him. Doc Henley, who'd patched his wounds, both physical and spiritual. Sheriff Mills, who'd given him a chance when no one else would. Mrs. Crawford, who'd rebuilt her life after losing her life's work and had become like a grandmother to Billy. Instead, you gave me the greatest gift anyone can offer, the chance to become better than I was. You let me earn your trust day by day, choice by choice. You taught me that a man isn't defined by his worst moments, but by what he does with the opportunities to make things right. Billy was grinning up at him from the crowd, pride shining in the boy's face like sunlight. Helen stood beside him, her hand resting protectively on Billy's shoulder, already every inch the mother he'd never really had. "This community saved my life," Tobias continued. "Not just from drinking or despair, but from becoming the kind of bitter man who lets grief poison everything he touches. You showed me that family isn't just about blood, but about people who choose to love each other despite their flaws." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out his father's watch, the broken timepiece that had started working again the night justice was served in the mountains. Its steady tick had become a comfort, a reminder that time could heal what seemed permanently damaged. "We're building something new here in Millbrook. Not just homes and businesses, but the kind of community where children can grow up safe, where people take care of each other, where second chances aren't just possible, but expected." He gestured toward the foundation being laid across the square, where the new orphanage was taking shape. It would be larger than the original, with modern safety features and a memorial garden where Anna's name was engraved in stone, alongside those of the other children who died. "That orphanage isn't just a building," Tobias said. "It's a promise that we'll protect the innocent, that we'll stand up to those who would harm the defenseless, that we'll never again let evil flourish in darkness while good people look away." The crowd murmured approval, many nodding at the sentiment. Edgar Vance's trial had been front-page news across the territory, exposing corruption that reached into the highest levels of government. 3 federal officials had been arrested, 2 railroad executives faced charges, and the consortium's entire Colorado operation had been shut down permanently. But most of all, Tobias concluded, his voice growing softer, this community taught me that love doesn't die with the people we lose. It grows stronger, reaching out to embrace new hearts, new families, new possibilities. My daughter Anna lives on in every child who'll be safe because we chose to fight for them. She lives on in Billy's laughter, in Helen's kindness, in the future we're building together. He raised his cup of punch in a toast. To Millbrook, to family, to second chances and new beginnings, to Millbrook. The crowd roared back, and the sound carried across the valley like a blessing. That evening, as the celebration wound down and neighbors began drifting home, Tobias walked with Helen and Billy to the cemetery where Anna lay beneath a headstone carved with angels. The boy carried a bouquet of wildflowers, not for mourning, but for remembrance. "I brought her something," Billy said shyly, pulling a small wooden horse from his pocket. It was beautifully carved, proportioned perfectly, sanded smooth and polished to a soft gleam. "I thought she might like to have it. You know, so she's not lonely." Tobias felt his throat tighten with emotion. "That's the finest piece of carving I've ever seen, son." Anna would treasure it. Billy placed the horse carefully at the base of the headstone, next to the flowers Helen had brought. For a moment, they stood in comfortable silence, three people who'd found each other in the wreckage of loss and built something beautiful from the pieces. "Do you think she knows?" Billy asked quietly. "About us being a real family now?" Tobias looked at the boy who'd become his son, at the woman who'd become his wife, at the small grave that had taught him the difference between guilt and love. Somewhere in the evening breeze, he could almost hear Anna's laughter, bright with approval. "I think she knows," he said finally, "and I think she's happy for us." Anna's silver cross caught the last rays of sunset, gleaming like a star against his chest. Tomorrow there would be work to do, children to protect, a community to serve, a family to nurture. But tonight, in the peace of the moment, Tobias Fletcher was exactly where he belonged. The broken cowboy had finally found his way home.